I'm Tammy Kolda, an applied mathematician, and this is Unlocking LaTeX Graphics. Today I'll talk about Addplot and PGFPLOTS, specifically the difference between Addplot without any arguments, Addplot with arguments, and Addplot plus with arguments. I generally advocate for manually specifying the plot styles, which means using Addplot, no plus, and with arguments. However, I'll also show you what happens when you use these other versions. They use something called the cycle list, which controls the appearance of the different plots. I'll finally show you my recommended way to use Addplot, which is to define a few plot styles up front and then just call them for your individual plots. The videos on this channel are based on my book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics, as well as some bonus materials. Here we have the basic document setup. I set the geometry to be a size that is convenient for our demo today. I'm using also the packages Parskip and HyperRef as conveniences. The key package is PGFPLOTS. I'm including some important recommended settings. You should set the compatibility to some version that's relatively recent. I'm using here 1.18. I'm also using the special incantation scale only axis, which indicates that the axis width and height should be what I specify rather than a fine transformation. Finally, this last incantation says that the marks that I'm using in my plots should have solid line styles, even if the rest of the line is something like dashed or dotted. Before we get started, I'll do some setup. Here I create a style called count data with settings for my plots. I'm going to specify the height and the width to be 7 by 10 centimeters. I'm going to set up the title, the X label, the Y label. I'm going to customize the XTick label style. That's where I'm going to be plotting the years. And I'm going to rotate those years by 45 degrees. And I'm going to set the number format so that the years don't have a comma after the first digit. I'm going to make sure I print every year as an explicit tick by setting the XTick distance to 1. I'm going to enlarge the limits a little bit less than the default. The default is 10%. I'm saying enlarge them by only 5%. I'm setting up the legend position to be outer northwest. And I'm setting the legend entries for the 4 things I'm going to plot. And I'm reversing the legend. And I'll try and remember to say why I did that. Now we're ready to create a graphic and add 4 plots. Here I'm adding a TikZ picture and an axis. And I'm using the style we just created, count data. And then I'm adding 4 columns from my data file, A, B, C, and D. When I plot that, a couple things to note. I'm specifying manually the type for each of these plots. This is the way I've advocated for doing it in the past videos. So the first plot, I'm specifying blue and solid circle marks. The second one is orange with a square mark, and so on. I'll note here that I reversed the legend A, B, C, D, and just that happens to be convenient for the way this data is. I plotted A first, but it's actually on the bottom, then B, then C, then D. So it just made more sense to me to plot that legend in reverse. So it lined up a little bit with the way the data is displayed. I'll quickly note a little bit about the XTick mark. So if you recall, I set the XTick label style to have a rotation of 45 degrees and a PGF number format 1000 sep to nothing, so that we see the result over here. We get the years. We also had the XTick distance equals 1. So we see every year plotted, rotated at 45 degrees, and no 1000 separator. Let me paste another plot here. This one is exactly the same as we had before, except that I have omitted the style specifications following Addplot. So what happens when I compile that? Now we get 4 plots, and each has been rendered in a different style, but I never told it what styles to use. It's actually pulling these styles from something called the cycle list, and it has a particular default that it uses. The first style is blue with solid circle marks. The second one is red with solid square marks. The third one is brown with solid circles, and the fourth is black with asterisks. This is what happens when you don't specify anything. It pulls from that cycle list. Now you can override the default plot style. In fact, that's what we're doing up here. And so let me show another example where I take almost the same plot, but I've overridden just the third plot with a specified style. So what happens when I compile that? When we go down to the result, we see here that it looks almost the same as the one where we use the default plots, except for that third plot, which is now using exactly what I specified, a dashed line that's thick, a solid triangle mark, and we increase the mark size to 3 pt. It just skips that third style entirely, and for the fourth plot, it uses the fourth plot in the cycle list. One thing that I have an option to do is instead of overriding that third plot style entirely, I can augment it. And that's what Addplot plus does. So if I were to put a plus here, and then look at this plot, when I compile it now with that plus, what has happened is this turns brown. It has inherited that from this default style, but everything else has been overwritten. It overwrote the solid line style. It overwrote the mark specification. Those things happened as if it just added on to that original style, these specifications that I have over here. The thing to remember is that the plus sign means add to the default style, which comes from this mysterious cycle list, while no plus sign means override the default style. I generally don't recommend using the cycle list. I really prefer to manually specify the styles and use those instead. So here's an example of how I would prefer to do something like this. Using PGFPLOTS set, I define 4 styles. So I'm just calling them A, B, C, and D. I define them however I want, and then I use them down here in my table, and it's very short to specify. So I compile that, and then we have our styles down here. And it makes it very easy for me to change how I want it to appear up here. I could always add on after the style specification in this other place. One of the reasons I recommend against the cycle list is that it's not very flexible. For example, it's hard to jump around within a cycle list to reuse or not use certain styles. You also have to be very careful about the order of the plots because the order of the plots determines which styles are used. It's also sensitive to things like forget plot, which is how you cause a plot to be omitted from the legend. It also has the side effect, at least when I've used it recently, of rolling back to the previous style in the cycle list, which you may not actually want to happen. For all these reasons, I generally advocate to just create your styles using PGFPLOTS set. And so if you give them some kind of easy to remember names, then you can use those as you need them when you're doing plots. I hope you enjoyed today's episode on PGFPLOTS and the Addplot command. I showed you how to use the Addplot with and without arguments and with this funny plus thing. I recommend against using the Addplot without arguments or using Addplot plus with arguments, which uses the cycle list under the hood. Instead, I'm recommending manually specifying the plot styles. Now, to be fair, there are some cases where the cycle list is useful, especially when doing a lot of plots. I'll try to cover that in a future video. I include a link to the overleaf document I created today in the show notes, and if you found this helpful or interesting, please click like or subscribe. If you have TikZ or PGFPLOTS questions, please post them in the comments. If you want to learn more, please check out the other videos. I also have a book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics, available for purchase at major book retailers. Thanks for watching.